So this room here is a picture of us during 3 days of portfolio planning. And so this is not big room planning for a PI or for a train. This is for the overall portfolio. And so what we're going to do over our time together is to tease out different parts of this room that either helped us be successful or helped us move, in preparation or during execution of the event. We find that it is helpful to context Travelport, but given that Travelport is a sponsor of this meetup, and given that a lot of folks may have already had some exposure, I think we can probably skip. Unless there's someone who says, I have no idea who Travelport is. Could you give me a teaser? Anyone?
I'll be that person.
Okay, good. So Travelport is one of the top 30 data processors in the entire world. Yet, no one knows about us. So anybody who travels, gets on an airplane, gets in a hotel, rents a car, books accommodations or activities when you're traveling, has used our platform. We back end the entire travel industry along with two other major brands that you may have heard of, Amadeus or Sabre. And so even since we've been presenting, our platform will have already processed close to 1/3 of a billion transactions, I believe. And that's just simply because we are connected to tens of thousands of travel providers, so like an airline or hotel, and tens of thousands of travel bookers or the people that actually you interact with when you book travel. And so that's what we do. We offer mobile apps, we offer a platform, we offer services to a lot of the folks in the ecosystem, but you likely as a traveler won't interact with Travelport directly. So a lot of this context around this presentation is, I think where Alan started was, Hilla, are you sure you want to do this? A lot of the work that we did was generating demand for the change and less about the actual launching of trains themselves. We positioned the organization to want Agile, to want to use scaled Agile. And so this curve here represents what we saw as we generated that demand in the organization. This was not what we did. This is what the organization came to our LACE, came to our central group and said, could you help with? Could you help with this? Could you help with that? So this was an email that I got from our chief technology officer and said, we're doing a budgeting session. And this is, what are we going to fund? How much do we have to fund? What hard decisions do we get to make? How big are our epics, and et cetera, et cetera. And so they said, well, could you help us structure this? So we didn't have to push because we had shown that bringing people into a room and getting conflict and getting healthy conflict was the way to bottom out and get a much more sustainable system. So we got out the Sharpie and we said, okay, well, if anybody on the call knows what PI planning is, that it has 3 primary work products. It has a program board that you create. It has objectives around what you're going to achieve, and then it has some risks. And we said, well, what if you were doing portfolio planning in the same fashion? What would you create? What would be the corresponding artifacts? And we realized that a program board maps to a portfolio board, which shows things like, which investment horizon and, what are dependencies between some of these and all that. PI objectives, well, that's what value are we actually delivering to the customer to, in terms of revenue or cost savings or whatever. And then Rome risks would be portfolio risks. So we started to see that there was some real similarity between a PI planning event and a portfolio planning event. So we use that as a guide to say, well, if we're going to plan this, would we map it exactly to PI planning? No, but we used it to start. Now,
I think, Charlie, if I can just jump in on that, one of the things I would add is there was a little bit of tension that we had getting to that point of recognizing the similarity between the PI planning and portfolio planning around some of the language. So Charlie touched on it, but really at a very high level, and to put a fine point on it. This portfolio planning we were looking at doing was with our C-suite, the highest level of the organization. And the language that's often used in transformations and in the technology space is not necessarily the same language as the business. And so what we found ourselves doing was trying to map a little bit between this idea of PI planning that the technical teams were very familiar with and this concept of sort of the corporate annual budget planning that was the language of our C-suite. So with that, I think a little bit more context there on some tension that really came out of this and forcing us to rethink how we approach things a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, we wanted to get rid of the game of hungry hippo of the annual planning cycle where the money just gets presented and everyone just grabs it on the table in a fury. You know, can you imagine a PI planning event like that? I'm just going to take a feature and golf in my corner. Well, the same happens at many annual cycles of companies. So we kind of considered that. So here's 3 learnings that we're going to dive into, and we're going to structure the conversation around these, where we believe that these will be tools for successful event for you, where if you invest in psychological safety, rethink the definition of teams, and rehearse for success, you will have a better event. So let's step into the first one. So we learned that value creation is directly related to psychological safety within a team. We could do what is psychological safety, how do you move in the direction of psychological safety, just as an exclusive topic. So apologies to someone who's saying, I didn't quite get enough of what psychological safety is, but we want to move in the direction to understand how one goes there and then what you do with it with these additional ones. So maybe it's a topic that we come back to or in a different meetup. So within investing in psychological safety, let's dig in. There's 3 points that we're going to cover, and then we'll come back to that anchor slide. So inside the room, you'll see this triangle up on the wall. Vulnerability-based trust. Anybody who knows that visual knows the 5 dysfunctions of a team model from Patrick Lencioni. And this, we believe, is the foundation for having great interactions with C-suite around portfolio planning, or quite fundamentally, even the basis of an agile team functioning well. So those who have understood this, I think, Hilla, you may have taught me this a couple years ago. There's 2 types of trust: predictive trust and vulnerability-based trust. Predictive trust is, I know that if I ask for a report from Sally, Sally is going to give me that report in the time that I ask her because she always does. I can trust in that. That's predictive trust. Vulnerability-based trust is very different, is I can share information with Sally knowing that Sally will never use that information against me. I can be vulnerable with that and I can trust in that. So it's a different kind of trust, but it's a critical kind of trust. And because we were presenting at the Scaled Agile Summit, we started to think, well, what does vulnerability-based trust have to do with PI planning or much less other large room events? So the 5 dysfunctions of a team has this pyramid where you can't get to the higher level without having the basis below. So without vulnerability-based trust at the anchor, you can't have meaningful conflict. It will just be superficial and interpersonal. But with meaningful conflict, you can secure commitment within that group. With that commitment, you can hold one another to account. And only once you've been able to hold one another to account can you actually achieve collective results. And so much of the failure that you have with teams is you say, well, we had great conflict and we got commitment from one another and we're holding each other accountable because we wrote it down, yet you don't have collective results. And a lot of that is because you skip that first step of introducing vulnerability-based trust within that team. So then we asked, well, does this map to Agile at scale, specifically Scaled Agile? Because that actually was quite interesting. When we started to see the collective results, well, they're PI objectives. Accountability, well, that's your commit to deliver rate, if you want to pick a metric. Commitment, well, that's your fist of 5. It's in the event where you commit to one another, your ability to do it. Conflict, PI planning is designed around conflict. It's designed to get everyone to suss out all of the dependencies and issues and concerns long before you actually start to deliver. But if you don't have vulnerability-based trust, you won't be successful in those top 4s if you don't have formed teams, invested teams that have vulnerability-based trust, you can't achieve those at the top. So this is a foundation for us, and we're spending a little extra time on it because if you don't think about through this lens, all the rest of the stuff we have to say won't matter. Now you're saying, well, this was a thing about, Charlie, I thought you were going to talk about, psychological safety. Well, the thing about vulnerability-based trust is ultimately it's a point-to-point. It's a person-to-person, is that model that Lencioni introduces, and a lot of it is based on interpersonal relationships. Whereas psychological safety is actually a shared belief among people that their actions will not be punished, or for speaking up for ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes will be punished. So there, it's when you have enough vulnerability-based trust in an organization, you then go in the direction of psychological safety. I'll just pause there. It's a lot. It's some bit academic. Questions, concerns, Hilla extensions, things I screwed up. No? Okay.
Keep going.
Okay, good. All right. So of our first 9 points, the first one is teach vulnerability-based trust. It's got to be there. Okay, so let's go back to the room and let's look at some other elements. So here we go. Teach healthy conflict. We talked about, we have vulnerability-based trust. What's that next level? Okay, I promise we're not going to walk all the way up the pyramid. It's going to move around. But these are some foundational elements we just have to stand by. So in this case, we use what's called the Thomas Kilmann conflict model, TKI, where a lot of times people think of conflict as bad. Conflict's really good. Sometimes the wrong kind of conflict can be really bad. And so you have to be considerate around what kind of conflict you're using. And this one, the TKI gives us a way to actually describe the conflict that's happening in the room. And so in our case, we actually taught TKI about 2 hours into the portfolio planning event, where we gave context, we talked about what we were doing, and then we said to a room of 80 people that had our CTO, our CIO, our chief product officer, our chief marketing officer, group vice presidents, directors, and then we said, okay, you all are going to have some conflict. Let's give you some tools to do it. So don't be afraid to take the appropriate tool for the things that you probably have. Be explicit about that and train the folks in the room. We like this model in that it's a simple one-page visual, and then it gives people language when they're in a room, when they're having conflict. Oh, we're competing. Well, if you could be a little bit more cooperative, we might get to a collaborating space. Or I really need to avoid that person for the next 10 minutes because they're angry. That's okay. That is totally acceptable because you know when to move about the model. So if we look in that room, it's a visual up in there. It was part of our ceremonies. Be intentional about that. So let's come back to the room and look at some other elements. So in our case, we said people are showing up with personal bias. They're showing up with their background, what org structure they're in, what work system they're in, what role they have, what title they have. But one of the biggest ones we saw was when people show up for portfolio planning or epic planning or investment planning, a lot of times they have skin in the game. They created it. They're the one advocating for their money. Their teams will be defunded if their money gets taken away, is how they show up. And so the SCARF model might actually play in a lot of that, in driving a lot of their personal bias. So what did we do? We all got our Harry Potter glasses out. No, what we did was we said, when you are at a table, and this is for anybody who knows participatory budgeting, it's a really cool idea. You say, all right, team, here's your 10 investments. And they cost about $15 million or $15,000 or whatever your order of magnitude is. And here, team, here's money. It's paper money. You can also go electronic. And you say, you have $8 million. Decide what to fund. And it's in that conversation where the value that's represented on the corridor of all of the epics, it's in that conversation where the trade-offs among them start to really come out. They can't be represented anywhere else. And when you have personal bias really driving artificial balance of voice, it kind of derails you. So we made a decision to say, if it's your epic, if it's your investment, you can't fund it. It's got to go to somebody else's table. So that everybody was asked to advocate for and fund somebody else's idea. So consider this as a way to then say, oh, it's a level playing field. Jimmy didn't get what Jimmy wants because Jimmy's the golden child, because Jimmy couldn't. Jimmy had no way to fund their own investments. And so what a lot of that what starts to do is it allows people to speak out, and that psychological safety can start to set in. So these three things around investing in psychological safety, there's many others, but this is, again, starting in that direction around teaching vulnerability-based trust, coaching healthy conflict, and removing personal bias. So rethinking definition of teams. So this is an extension of where we were last year around rethinking the definition of just teams. And we observed that an enterprise's flow performance is directly related to the health of its most cross-functional team, the C-suite. So I promise this will be the last academic bit here coming up. But let's come back to the room, and we're going to look at the entire room for a second. We're not going to white out anything. Because everybody in this room lives in two contexts. They live in the secondary network on the left of all of their trains that they're on, and their cross-functional agile teams, and their tiger teams that they're on, and the initiative, blah, 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 whatever. But then they also live in an org structure. And those two worlds coexist. They cannot not coexist. They might be perfectly overlapping. I've never seen that organization. So what we started to see was, well, how do those interact? And we were presenting Scaled Agile, and we use Scaled Agile. This can be in other ways, but we saw it through the train levels and through the portfolio level. So we said, let's get out our official org chart. Here it is, Travelport's official org chart. You can see our CEO at the top, we got a chief commercial officer and our CIO, et cetera. And if you go down the org chart, you can see how it gets a little bit messy. And it gets really messy when you start considering the people in yellow are on a cross-functional team. You got a QA person over here, you got a designer over there, you got a salesperson in there as a product owner over here, blah, 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 right? Okay. Well, what happens when those people in yellow have issues? They can use the secondary network, but most times, many times, frequently enough, whatever your balance is at your organization, they go up their org chart. They go to their lead in red. Now, do these people in red know each other? Maybe. Do they work together? Sometimes. Do they share vulnerability-based trust with one another? Most likely not. So we saw that you can invest in these teams. Treat them as a team above these agile release trains. Now, why this is so important with portfolio planning is we start to see that you need to not only invest in the hierarchy and the secondary network, but you need to work even harder to invest in that secondary network. So anybody who understands trains knows that there's a release train engineer and a system architect or product manager. But then there's also other people who have staff on that train or who have commercial interest in that train, like architecture or the sales group or the QA director, because all of your QA folks happen to be in a different organizational structure. Actual line managers for some of the people. Invest in a leadership team there. Teach them vulnerability-based trust. Make them a durable team above the agile teams. And where this starts to get interesting is, well, what we looked at is, as you think about a portfolio, this starts to fall down because you have 10 art leadership teams, and they're all supported by many of the group vice presidents, whatever the title is for you, and the C-suite. So take this heavy effort of formation and actually invest in the team above them, the team of teams, and form a leadership team above them. So we're going to dive into how we did that. I think Hilla, I start to transition over to you at some point, where you know, in our case, the head of product, that's somebody in our C-suite. The head of technology, well, that's your CTO. The head of infrastructure, well, that's your CIO. And so we actually, before the event, during the event, and after the event, invested heavily in getting them to be a higher functioning cross-functional leadership team. Okay. So let's come back to the room and let's have a look at them. There they are. That's the C-suite. They're sitting there at the center table in the room. And before our planning event, we had them come together. We had them, I think, for 6 hours on the Monday before. The event started Tuesday. They flew in early, and we said, okay, team, what do you want out of this? And they were much like you have an art leadership team or the management problem solving sessions during PI planning. We mimic that with this team. Now, a lot of them are saying, I don't really need to show up. I'm too busy. And we said, okay, that's fine. Just come in and present your shared vision around what you want out of this week. And they go, we don't have that written down. Oh, we don't agree on that. And we go, well, let us help. And that then was the pre-event. So instead of having breakfast at a leisurely pace, they had to come in each morning around 6 a.m. and they stayed until at least 10 o'clock at night, course correcting and learning from the day and figuring out what then needed to be adjusted. Okay, I think, Hilla, is this where you take over?
Sure thing. I can run us forward from there. Final takeaway in this piece is really around preparing for the delegated decision making. So we're going to be asking, we talked about how we brought the leaders together into the room and how we prepared the leadership to be in that room with the attendees. We also needed to prepare the attendees for how to interact with the leaders, because in some of the cases, they hadn't interacted before. They hadn't been familiar with making some of the business decisions they were being asked to make. And so we needed to talk them through and prepare them. What kind of questions might you ask? And really start to speak in the language of the business in doing that. Can you move ahead to the next slide? So we started to talk about, what questions are the leaders going to ask you? They're going to ask things like, why is this important? What happens if we don't do this? What's the cost of delay in doing something? Well, what does this whole cost of delay thing mean? Because, cost of delay is a concept that's understood sort of from a sales and marketing lens around, what happens if we miss this market opportunity? And so bringing that then into the room of people that are informed on how to build the systems that deliver on the solutions was an important part of that. And then anticipating what might the answers be. We did things like we created a planning guide. So I think next slide, Charlie.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
There we go. So thanks. We created a planning guide. We talked about what were the goals of the planning of this event. We set the expectations in that, and we shared the format and the materials we'd be using. We put this together. I think it's about a 20-page document. I referred to this earlier on, and we will make this available should you have interest in it. Just send us an email. But the idea here was all on the same page. Everybody has transparency to process, transparency to output, and intended outcome, so that we could get everybody well aligned. This we delivered about a week before the session started. We went ahead and set this out so that everybody had time to read it. We also shared the materials. So as Charlie was talking about the investments, we shared those investment cases out with everybody, so everybody had the opportunity to see it and be able to read it and formulate questions so that they could start to do some of the pre-work of asking those questions, because we were going to surface this in this conversation. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So key takeaway here is really, if you've never done this before, and for Travelport, when we did this, this was the first time we had done it. So we needed to equip the GVPs, the vice presidents, directors, and we had some of our technical subject matter experts in there as well. We need to equip them for that decision making, and so to be able to help the leaders make the decisions around where the millions need to be spent. I think that's that on that one. We're going to head back, I think, to the anchor slide next, and we're going to talk about rehearsing for success.
Hey, Hilla, I do have Sharon's video if you ever want to play it. I did cue it up.
Oh, that should have been played up front.
Oh, okay.
We missed that opportunity. Let me close out this point, then let's go ahead and maybe put that at the very end just to sort of end the conversation.
Cool.
So really rethinking the definition of a team of teams by asking them to invest in their leadership teaming, coaching that servant leadership. So we had coaches embedded in these groups to be able to help to develop and to help support the decision making, and then preparing for that delegated decision making. Moving on, we're going to talk about rehearsing for success, where we found that portfolio planning occurs when we had it well rehearsed. And that sounds almost a little cliche. And so let's step into what that looks like. And it actually was born out of a cliche in and of itself. So again, we're back to our anchor picture. And we're going to talk a little bit about what rehearsing for success means. We're going to step through that by talking about some of the artifacts that are on the wall, and how we got to building those artifacts. So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit from a backwards lens. In the back of the room there, you see there are tape wall boards up on the wall. One of the principles we talked about, and Charlie mentioned the corridor of epics. Think of these as your business cases, your lean business cases. For organizations that aren't, fully agile, these might be projects or programs or portfolios. And so we had those all visualized. We created a board where on the back of the wall where we wanted to be able to display how we got from where we are today to where we need to be 3 years from now. And one of the principles for that was visualizing all of the work. We need to be able to see it. We need to be able to see, what things do we need to sunset? What things do we really want to invest in? When do we want to make those things? So we're going to step into, and go ahead to the corridor of epics, Charlie. So when we talk about, lean business cases and visualizing the work, I think we had about 100 investments, somewhere between 80 and 100 investment needs that have been brought forth from the business. This was from our infrastructure teams. This was from our sales teams. This was from the software development teams. All the way across the organization, targeting different business needs that we needed to solve for. And we had asked the various owners of the investments use a simple template where they would capture the intent, the market they were going after, the benefits to the business, and the investment costs, the opportunity cost if we missed the window that we were trying to hit, and then get that all up there on the board. You can see that there are things like sticky notes on the board, and you can see one of our gentlemen writing on the canvas itself. We'll talk about that in a little bit later, but as we talk about thinking about technology. But we wanted to make it very accessible. We went ahead and put up on that backboard. Now we're very zoomed in on this picture, and you can see we had what we were focusing on for 2020, 2021, 2022. And then off on the left-hand side there, you see the 0. Those are actually planning horizons. So if you think in from the lens of a product life cycle, a product life cycle goes through from sort of its early envisioning to where you're sort of installing it, extracting it, and retiring it and sunsetting it. So looking at that sort of a flow, we then cross-cut on each of these to say, which products do we want to invest in? Which products do we need to sunset? When do we need to do that by? If you can skip to the next slide. We then took from the 3-year view and we set up a 1-year view. So this was the micro view of what was on the 3-year board. And looking at our planning, so imagine planning quarters, if you plan in, PIs or program increments, whatever that cadence is in your organization, we broke it out by those quarters and PIs that we invested in. And then really we're able to talk about, okay, in this time box, this is what we're going to be focusing on delivering. And everybody that was part of that conversation, we used the very same principles that we use in PI planning. Reading out, working as table groups, collaborating together, putting it up on the board, visualizing the work, finding the dependencies, and identifying those with the strings. You can see the strings across the board that represent the dependencies. And then, being able to get to the point where our goal was to be able to get to a committed plan across this leadership team.
And Hilla, an extension here is, it wasn't that we just like worked for a couple days and then this was on the wall and then somebody read out and that was it. It was iterative. So we get a view of it. There would be issues, there'd be concerns, there'd be groups that would form. We'd realize, and then we come back and we revisit it. And so this is not just a end readout. This is actually, I think, one of the earlier of like, hey, this is what we're seeing, this is what we're going to do. And then we'd go back, we'd plan, we'd come back. And so that iterative nature of it, again, got the conversation going. And just to tie back to the pieces from the beginning, we could not have the kinds of conversations about this board if we didn't have vulnerability-based trust present in that room. If psychological safety wasn't present and people felt worried about talking about concerns in front of one of the C-suite, we weren't going to get a quality plan. And so that's why, again, I'll just make my commercial. If you don't have those items present first, all of these pieces around tool sets and string and post-it notes really won't do much for you, because your conversations about those boards will be superficial at best.
All right, so let's continue on. So principle here: visualize the work, create it in a way that makes sense, use the language of your organization that folks are familiar with. So now we're going to talk about, well, a lot of sticky notes. We're very, we work in this geographically dispersed, sort of socially separated environment now with, in this sort of post-COVID world. And so how would that actually work? And so one of the things that we focused on here is thinking about our technology. So when we're in an in-person setting, there's a little bit different of an approach you're going to want to take than what we have right now. But the principle of design thinking your technology is really at play here. So in a geographically dispersed world, rethink your tools, understand what your principles are. What are you trying to get out of this? And for us, the very important piece of this was the conversation, much more so than the tool we were actually using. And so, in subsequent sessions that we've had, we've used, all the apps that Charlie had up there on the previous slide. But fundamentally, and I mentioned when we were talking about that corridor of epics, you saw sticky notes up there. We really intentionally wanted that to be a living document. So we kept our technology as minimal as possible. We had a host of interns that had been working through our intern program that we had pulled into this engagement to help be able to capture some of the activity that was going on in the room so that we could then put it in tools for later use. But we did not want the tools to limit the conversation in the room. And so we tried to almost make it invisible. So I think one of the principles here is, don't be afraid to go very simple. Figure out what your focus point is and allow people to really have conversation rather than, being stuck with, a technological solution that may or may not work. We all know how frustrating that can be. All right, so principle again, design, think your technology. So now we're going to walk through, let's see here, next slide, from our anchor point again. We're going to talk about the people at the table and how did we support them. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier. And so, we had coaches and coaches are, you think, okay, well, how many coaches did you really have? Well, we had one coach at every single table. We had one coach for the entire room as well, somebody looking at it more from a systems view, as well as somebody helping to support each of the teams. And the coaches were, some of them were coaches that had been coaches by profession in the Agile space. Others were people in the organization that had been part of our transformation journey already and had become familiar with things. And so what we did is really help to prepare them around the questions around how to support the groups and how to bring them to the same level of conversation and engagement with the team with whom they're going to be working at the table group. Next slide.
Is it? There we go.
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
And so let's see here, closing that out. I would say, you know, we in doing that, so with our coaches, and then with about 25% of the room, and it might have actually been more, we practiced what we were going to be doing. So what were the activities? How were we going to do participatory budgeting? How are we going to review the different business cases and make decisions? And so all of the activities that were done, we rehearsed them in small groups, we rehearsed them in large groups, we rehearsed them cross-functionally, cross-organizationally, you know, geographically, just across the board, we rehearsed and rehearsed and rehearsed. And, you know, this sort of came from this idea of when we were presenting back at the Agile Summit, what was it, the Global Summit in October, we were talking about, we're getting ready for the presentation, and, you know, I'm not a natural speaker in front of a lot of people, and so I was a hot mess getting ready for it, and we'd rehearsed this thing 9 ways to Sunday. And, you know, we had the opportunity to present right behind somebody who was a professional ice skater, skating in front of 17,000 people. And, you know, I made the comment of, oh, practice makes perfect, and well, you know, we're practicing. And he's like, no, practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. So, Charlie, if you want to continue, that sort of stuck with me. And so really it became an anchor point for the conversation around how do we rehearse for all these different pieces. So we knew what the outcome was going to be, what the outputs were going to be, and how that session would really look as we came to it. Rehearsing for success, really visualizing all your work, design thinking your technology, and perfect practice making perfect. Don't underestimate the practice part of this. I think what I would say then, sort of stepping back, is, you know, when Charlie at the very beginning showed that snippet of an email around, hey, can't you do this for our annual planning? From the time that we got that email to the time that we held this event was 3 calendar weeks. So really it was, you know, set an aggressive date, get out there, go after it, and really, you know, embrace the opportunity to think a little bit differently about how you do some of these things. You know, most of us already know how to do this. We've done a lot of this stuff before, and sometimes it's a matter of fractaling our own thinking to be able to, you know, achieve an outcome that we want to get to. I don't know if you have other stuff to add, Charlie, but I'd love to open it up to questions.
No, I think we open it up to questions. I do wonder if we show Sharon's just kind of to drive home the...
Yeah, let's do that.
And if it doesn't work, just say, hey, Charlie, something's not working. I'm going to see if I can...
Make sure you share your computer's audio. When you do that, that's what you have to tick that button.
Got it. That's a great point. Okay, we're just going to do the whole screen. We're going to go over to Sharon, and we're going to see if it works or not. There we go. Sharon, go.
So most beneficial practice today, probably looking back on previous years, I think we would have spent maybe 4 or 6 months getting to the same outcome that we've actually got to today in one day. And that outcome probably wouldn't have actually been agreed by anybody. So I think the most beneficial side of this is really a time-saving exercise, get people together, having a conversation in the room, making decisions in real time. So most beneficial practice.
So that's Sharon Doyle. She's our global head of.
Well, thank you so much. This will be available on YouTube and our channel as soon as Christine gets it back up there. And thank you very much for your time. That was pretty awesome. And everyone, those were great questions. I'm sure as you start to think about doing something like this on your own, you'll have more questions.
Just give us a shout.
That's what I was waiting to heir. Didn't want to volunteer yet, but
no, we're
no,
here.
It's important to us, giving back into the community. So, you know, if anybody's wanting to attempt this, try to design a session, we're happy to help.